Dennis slipped out of the studio and shut the door behind him. He was finally finished with another long day of recording in the rainy Welsh countryside, and all he wanted was to go back to his room and be left alone. When he passed his bandmate in the hallway, a person that he had spent the past couple of years conquering Australia with, they couldn't even meet each other's eyes. They each pretended the other wasn't even there. How did it come to this? After all they'd done, after all they'd been through, was this really the end? This is the story of Radio Birdman. If you end up enjoying this video, please consider giving it a like. That really helps in the algorithm. And if you want to join me as I'm trying my best to learn as much as I can about music history, consider subscribing. It's free to do. You can always unsubscribe if you don't like it. And if you want earlier access to videos, access to polls where you get to vote on the next topic I cover, and access to some members only content, then you can become a member. The link to do that is in the description below. Dennis Tech grew up near Detroit, Michigan, in a town called Ann Arbor, and he was born in 1952. When he was a kid, he got a transistor radio that allowed him to really dig into music, listening to the pop girl groups and the surf rock bands, and really anything other than folk music. His real love for most of his childhood was the British invasion bands, like the Tornadoes and the Kinks. He explained, "About the only thing I didn't like was some of the folk stuff at the time, apart from the Kingston Trio. Hot rod music was cool, radio was pretty good back then. Things weren't very commercial or market driven because really big money hadn't found its way into the music yet." By the time he was 12, he was playing guitar, and he formed a short-lived rock band with his friend Roger Miller called the Inducers. Roger Miller went on to form a pretty popular punk, post-punk band called Mission of Burma, and Dennis said that his first guitar teacher was Dan Erlewine, who was playing in a band called the Prime Movers, which had Iggy Pop on drums. While in the Inducers, his first live show he remembered seeing was a group called the Rationals, which he described as playing a kind of punk R&B. They played a dance at his junior high, and he was incredibly impressed with them. But it wasn't until 1968 that things really got started for him. His dad was a professor, and he was given 1967 as like a sabbatical year, and he was a huge fan of tennis, so he decided to take that sabbatical in Australia. So Dennis spent all of 1967 living in Australia. So he missed that kind of like summer of love hippie movement that exploded into the American scene. And by the time he got back to Detroit in 1968, it felt like everything was different. The entire musical landscape had been shaken up, and there were some really cool. What is my camera doing? There were some really cool Detroit-based rock bands that were really exploding into the scene. Bands like MC5 and the Stooges, who were doing things completely differently, and it was really exciting and interesting to him. After he graduated from high school, he decided he wanted to pursue a career in medicine, and he wanted to study in Sydney after taking some time to travel around Europe and Africa for a bit. So in 1972, he officially moved to Australia. Pretty quickly, he realized that music would be a super important part of his life, but the scene in Australia at that time was much different than his hometown scene. He said, "I spent my first week after arrival in the Royal National Park on the beach, but there was not much going on musically, just formalized post-hippie marketing stuff. So I had to make my own way. There was no scene to latch onto like there had been where I grew up in Ann Arbor. So I was on my own now. No more copying." His first band ended up being called TV Jones after a few different names that didn't quite stick, and their primary audience was in a pretty industrial town about 50 miles south of Sydney. When they tried to break into the more commercial and established Sydney scene, they were completely and utterly rejected. And since he was the primary instigator of their style, the primary creative force, the band decided to kick Dennis out and try something different in order to kind of break in more commercially. So he was back on his own. Dennis started living with a guy named Ron Keeley, who let Dennis live in the cupboard under the stairs of his house for like $6 a week. Ron Keeley was a drummer from a smaller town and was sent to boarding school when he was about 8. At 16, he left school to join the Navy, and he originally wanted to play piano, but was kind of forced into picking up the drums. Ron was also already in a band because a friend of his, Rob Younger, approached him about wanting to start a band, and he wanted Ron to play drums in it. Ron was initially pretty hesitant because Rob and the other guy they were starting the band with had not been in bands before, knew really nothing about it. So he was like, why should I do this? This doesn't sound all that great. But he eventually did join, and they started a band called The Rats, which wasn't very successful, but was really popular in their like small little scene and amongst their friends. The band broke up when Warwick Gilbert, the guitarist, decided it was time to leave. He was tired of the bickering between Rob and Ron, and he just had a kid, so he felt like it was time for him to start a new chapter in his life. Through Ron and their shared interest in the Sydney underground scene, Dennis met Rob Younger. They became really good friends and bonded over their shared musical taste and their shared love of music and the underground rock scene. It was just kind of assumed, since they got on so well and had the same interest and musical sensibilities, it was assumed that if anything happened to their respective bands that they were both in, TV Jones and the Rats, that they would just work together on something. Dennis described meeting Rob and said, "He's the first person I met in Australia who actually even knew about the music scene in Detroit and Ann Arbor, and he knew how wild it was. He was a very deep record collector, and his taste in music, I would say his line of thinking was very similar to mine." Rob was shocked when TV Jones kicked Dennis out. Rob thought that everything interesting that that band was doing came from Dennis. The Rats and TV Jones were kind of similar in sound and attitude, but Rob said that the Rats were doing only cover songs, where TV Jones had originals, mostly written by Dennis. So it just kind of made sense with the Rats breaking up and Dennis being a free agent to form something together. And they both shared a common sensibility towards the music industry. They both thought that in the 60s and earlier, music was so cool because the people in the industry, the people making the decisions, the gatekeepers, they actually enjoyed music. They were fans of music. And then in the 70s, everything became so commercial, and the people calling the shots weren't necessarily a fan of the music. They were just a fan of making money. And that changed the entire landscape. That changed how the popular music sounded. So, as Rob put it, the stuff that was rocking and melodic was forced underground. Or, as Ron said, there are times when you should react strongly to bad music, times when a statement should be made. Radio Birdman can kind of be seen as that statement against the way the music industry was working at that time. And the first person they called to join this new band was a keyboardist named Pip Hoyle. Philip Hoyle said that he grew up in a very loving and wonderful environment where his parents encouraged him to pursue his musical interest, and he wanted to be a professional musician of a more classically trained variety, writing orchestra pieces and stuff like that. But his father convinced him that maybe he wouldn't make a ton of money through music, so why not try something else first and just kind of do music on the side? So he started studying medicine at the same place that Dennis was studying medicine, and they both felt a little bit like outsiders, like they didn't really mesh with the type of students that they were meeting there. Pip also played in TV Jones, but he only lasted like a couple of gigs before the rest of the people in the band got annoyed with him and kicked him out because he didn't play in a traditional 4/4 style, which was something that Dennis really loved and appreciated, but the rest of TV Jones didn't really like all that much. And I just want to pause here and say that a lot of that background information about Pip came from this incredible documentary about Radio Birdman called Descent into the Maelstrom. So definitely watch that. You'll get more of their perspective on things and more of their voice into this early history. So super valuable. Definitely check that out. So with Pip on keys, Rob on vocals, Dennis on guitar, and Ron on drums, they started working on music, determined to do exactly what they wanted, with no interest in what would be commercial. They also had a guy named Carl Roke, who was formerly of the Rats, on bass, and they called themselves Radio Birdman, which was a misheard lyric from the song 1970 by the Stooges. They started performing locally, mostly shows to just their dozen or so friends, and their gigs were always loud and aggressive. Rob said that he remembered the band members outnumbering the fans in attendance at a lot of these earlier dates. Dennis said that they became confrontational in their shows because that's what was expected of them. They would be routinely thrown out of bars and clubs, so they took on this outlaw persona since that's how they were being treated anyway. They figured if you're going to call us outlaws, if you're going to treat us like outlaws, then we'll be outlaws. And that meshed really well with their idea of being a rock band that didn't care about any rules. They knew they were on to something special with this new project. One review of an early gig in Sydney said, "Radio Birdmen are a vision. Crude and angry and unrepentant, they're fueled on no ordinary motivation. The radios are visionaries and reflectors of big city phenomena. You can hear the Underground Railway in their music. You can feel the denseness of signs and traffic and buildings and people in the layerings of violent guitar riffs rubbing against thunderings of bass and drums." After a few too many times of being kicked out of the venues and the clubs that they could realistically play in, they realized that if they were going to do this, if they were going to actually be able to establish themselves and not compromise their art and do what they wanted to do, then they needed to do it themselves. They couldn't rely on promoters and bookers. So they started renting their own PA equipment and booking their own shows. And eventually they landed a residency at a place called the Oxford Tavern. There's an interview I read that's Dennis said that Lou Reed helped them get that residency. Couldn't find any more information about that. Couldn't figure out how Lou Reed was involved at all. So maybe it's just he was a fan of Lou Reed, and so was the person over the Oxford Tavern. Don't know. But that's out there. Anyway, they got a residency at the Oxford Tavern, and then slowly, eventually, they were able to take over the management of it and like all of the booking, and they renamed it the Oxford Funhouse. That venue, the Funhouse, became the epicenter of the punk movement in Australia, and their Radio Birdman's shows were allowed to inflate and become even more extreme. Dennis remembered about this crazy, like, performance art era of their live show, and he said, Pip had a real human skull. Its name was Govinda and used to sit on top of a mic stand at gigs, like a mascot. We got the idea of buying sheep brains at the butcher and putting them into Govinda's cranium. We did that, and Rob took it a step further by eating the raw brain and spitting it off the front of the stage. The place cleared out in an instant. Seemed like a great idea at the time. And he said later that like everyone at that show were already fans of Radio Birdman. It was their show. So he said that the audience cleared out, and he thought it was a good indicator that they were on the right path, that they could still clear out an audience of their fans. They described their sets as performance art. Since they kind of were the scene at that point, people would come see them all the time, like multiple times a week. They wanted to keep it fresh for the regulars, so they'd always try to be confrontational in their art and challenge expectations. But eventually, probably after the whole eating brains thing, they realized that they'd gone a bit too far and it had become more of a spectacle than they wanted, and they decided to kind of tone it back and focus on the music. By the time of the Funhouse and all of this really getting going, Carl had left the group, being replaced by Warwick Gilbert, the person who had previously left the Rats because he was tired of the bickering and he had a child. Warwick was really into art as a kid, and he started loving guitar after hearing Jeff Beck. His love of art made him an outsider at school, so he really connected with Rob Younger when he met him at school, who was also into music and art. This lineup recorded for the first time at Trafalgar Studios. Essentially, they were allowed to record when no one else was paying to use the studio, so they worked on any recordings very piecemeal over a long span of time. The studio also agreed to distribute the EP and the eventual album they made, so essentially the studio like set up a label specifically to release Radio Birdman Records and a few other smaller bands that they were friends with. Dennis said that it was the first indie label in Australia, but haven't verified that, so he could be wrong. At this time, the music scene in Sydney was very different than the stuff that the radios wanted to do. Dennis said that it was all based around like blues rock and country rock that was already dated by the time these Australian bands started playing it, and that they weren't interested in making anything like that. It felt like nothing interesting or exciting had happened in the Australian music scene for a long time, and they were determined to change that, or at least determined to not fall into the same mold of just playing Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin covers because that's what would get them shows and get them record deals. They didn't care about that. They wanted to make what they wanted to make. Their debut album, Radios Appear, which was recorded very piecemeal across several months because of the whole studio situation, was released in 1977. They made it because the EP they released previously did pretty well, so they figured it was time for an album. It was pretty well loved, earning 5 stars from different music industry magazines, but as kind of an indie release in Australia, it was never going to be a huge runaway success. Sometime around this time, I don't know the exact dates, I'm not sure of the exact timeline, Pip left the group. And in order to keep a large sound on stage, they brought in a second guitarist named Chris Moswick. Pip did eventually rejoin the group, and whenever he did, they kept Chris on anyway. Pip said that he left because there was a death in his family, and he took a year off of everything, including school, but he never lost his love or passion for the band. He was still going to the shows. But that lineup of Dennis, Rob, Ron, Pip, Chris, and Warwick is seen as like the classic lineup of Radio Birdman. Chris Moswick was from Canada. He was born in, as he called it, the frontier of northern Alberta. There wasn't much around, so he grew up listening to music and playing music just to have something to do. He started piano lessons when he was 5 and started on guitar when he was around 12, and his dad gave him an old homemade guitar. Pretty soon, he was playing guitar in bands around Canada, trying to convince bars to let him play, even though he was far too young to get into them. And that's also where he got a nickname Klondike. It's kind of said that Chris was a bit of a guitar prodigy. He was really good at it, and when he joined the radios, they were just kind of blown away at how quickly he could catch on, and Dennis would like play a riff and then Chris could immediately copy it, and it was just kind of like An insane musical talent is how it was described. As a teenager, Chris migrated to Australia and pretty quickly found himself in one of the most exciting bands in the area at only 17 years old. And they described in the documentary that he just kind of hung around the band and was at rehearsals, at shows. So that's how he connected with them. That's how they found him and brought him in. At this point, there was really no practical way to DIY the music scene in Australia. No one was self releasing anything. The Saints had self released their debut single in 1976, like a couple weeks before Radio Birdman self released, or Trafalgar Studios released, but kind of similar situation, but their debut EP. Before that, no one had really done anything like that. So they were just kind of making it up as they went along, but they did a lot of things differently. They actually had a fan club and they were able to utilize that fan club to sell Radio's Appear, their debut album, to a pretty decent amount of people, which resulted in a lot of attention, and eventually it got him a distribution deal, which made things a little bit easier. They were doing things very differently than other artists in Australia. Instead of falling in line and playing by the rules, climbing up the Australian music hierarchy, they didn't care about any of that. They designed their own imagery, creating logos and posters to hang everywhere, most of them kind of initiated by Dennis, but fully designed by Warwick. They booked their own shows. They recorded how they wanted to, all in a room together instead of in pieces. They had a fan group that at times felt like a cult. As Chris said, we were not in any way aware that we were creating a phenomenon, but it was happening around us. And Ron explained, the only difficulties that arise are when somebody tries to change us around. The music we play is between us and an audience. The funny thing is, we've never had any trouble with audiences, only with promoters or people who think we should fit in with their ideas of what a conventional rock band should be. They were a fiercely independent group. They knew exactly what they wanted to do, and they were not willing to change for anyone. No one could dictate what they sounded like in order to sell a few more records. As you could imagine, that made them difficult to sign, especially in Australia, where the music industry was a little less open to experimentation at that point. But then Seymour Stein took a trip to Australia. Seymour was from New York, and through co-founding a label called Sire Records, he was already establishing himself as kind of like the king of punk in America. He was someone who understood the cutting edge of music, and he wanted to be a part of it. He was in Australia to try and convince the Saints to sign with him when he saw Radio Birdman play at the Funhouse. He was blown away and immediately licensed Radio's Appear for distribution in the US, and then signed the band to a contract with Sire Records, which was actually pretty scary for the band that wanted to be independent. But Dennis could tell that Seymour was like them. Dennis said that Seymour shared their feelings, that rock music had become too commercial. He said he came from the earlier time when it was more exciting, and he was trying to bring that idea back. He succeeded to a degree, starting with bands like the Ramones. Seymour ended up releasing an updated version of Radio's Appear with a few re-recorded songs. Discogs says that the new version is 50% different from the original, but I have no idea how they calculated that. According to Dennis, Sire didn't restrict them in any way and allowed them to keep doing exactly what they wanted. The band was ready to leave Australia and start playing overseas, and in those days, a larger distribution deal at the very least was kind of the only way to realistically do that, and that was one of the primary reasons that they decided to sign with a label and take that risk. Meanwhile, they were creating a large and vibrant and really cool scene around the Funhouse. It's been described as these things typically are, the CBGB of Australia. It's kind of where these bands were allowed to rehearse to a live audience and work on their sound and their image, and this whole scene developed. Dennis described a typical night at the Funhouse, saying, "It cost $1 to get in, and the money all went towards printing handbills and posters and to pay the door girl. In its heyday, there would be 200 people crammed in, dancing and going wild. We would play a couple of sets. The first set would be loud, tight, and fast. Then we would be smoking joints and drinking out of a bottle of Jim Beam in the toilets in between sets. In the interest of progress, we would always try something experimental in the second set, so the regulars wouldn't get bored." With this new Sire deal, the band was able to expand outside of Australia, outside of the Funhouse scene, and they started setting up European tours. They had one scheduled with the Flamin' Groovies, but that ended after like 2 days when the Flamin' Groovies guitarist ruptured a tendon in his hand on a broken champagne bottle. Still, Sire had grand plans to send them on a super long tour, hoping to break them in the UK and Europe first before tackling the States. So, Radio Birdman decided to do a string of shows in Sydney as kind of like a farewell thing. They set up 3 nights at Paddington Town Hall. It wasn't supposed to be a farewell or a goodbye or anything. They expected to come back, but they knew that they were leaving for an extended period of time. Those shows would be the last time they played Australia. Well, until the various reunions. That last show has become pretty infamous, with people calling it the most chaotic show in Australia's history. There were smashed windows and bloodstains and a toppled PA system. After that night, the band even thought that things were getting a little out of hand and they were kind of ready to step away from that Sydney scene that they helped to build. They'd figured they'd move to the UK for a bit and do a tour of the UK and Europe before heading out to do like a 6-month tour with the Ramones in the US to close out 1978. By the time they came back to Australia, it would have been like a year and things would have calmed down. Fortunately, didn't quite pan out that way. By this point, they must have felt, even if they were living in denial, that the band was falling apart. Dennis explained, "We were sick, tired, broke, and suffering from all kinds of personal and interpersonal problems. I was in denial, even though the band was coming apart at the seams." They had always argued. They said that during the good times, it felt like a family, but like a family, they also fought quite a bit. They all felt like they were in the best band in the world, but couldn't stop the petty arguments despite that. Dennis did take songwriting credit for the songs on the first album, which annoyed some of the people in the group who felt like their contributions to the rhythm section, to the guitar work, warranted writing credit. Warwick talked about how the band kind of split in two, with Dennis and Rob on one side and Warwick, Chris, and Ron on the other side. I have no idea where Pip fit into all of this inner band dynamics, but I think he was on the not Dennis and Rob side. That was, at least in the eyes of some people in the band, a split that was encouraged by their manager, who thought that Dennis and Rob were clearly the frontmen, clearly the focal point and the driving force of the band. But the band was so good that that tension and resentment was set aside and ignored and overlooked instead of brought up and dealt with. Another thing that they often overlooked was the idea that Dennis and Pip had an expiration date. They were both still committed to being doctors. After they graduated, it seemed likely that they would leave the band, or at the very least, not be able to go on long tours, not be able to go tour America because they were going to be doctors. But they just kind of ignored that and kept having fun because they all felt like the band was so special and so good that they weren't going to risk it by bringing up these kind of things that they were struggling with. So they played these last shows at Paddington Town Hall and were planning on going to England. And Warwick claims that at this point, he had already decided he was going to leave the band. He was already kind of done with it, but he wanted to go to England. He said that the band had been using his artwork without giving him any money for it for years. So at the very least, they owed him a trip to England. As Ron said, it was us against the world, most definitely, but also it was us against each other from time to time. The personalities could really screw it up. So, in the midst of all of this band turmoil, all of them really not getting along, stuck in poverty in England, they began working on a new album in Wales. They spent 3 weeks trying to record an album while also trying to avoid each other. That album eventually came out after the master tapes were lost for a bit as an album called Living Eyes in 1981. Several of the members, like Ron and Pip, said they felt excluded from the creative process while making it. As if all of that wasn't enough, they also were getting no support from Seymour Stein and Sire Records. Sire was in the process of going bankrupt. Seymour got in way over his head, signing punk bands all around the world, so they had a really impressive stable of super cool bands, but very few of them made any money and were just kind of draining resources. In order to try and keep the label afloat, they decided to drop basically every band that wasn't a cash cow, and that included Radio Birdman. So now the band was stranded in the UK with next to no financial support, separated from their tight-knit community of fans that they had built in Australia, and now that they were not a Sire band, they weren't going on tour with the Ramones in the US anymore. It was an incredibly dark time for the group. In June of 1978, they played one last show at Oxford University and then broke up. And they describe in that documentary that last show at Oxford University, they had a lot of their friends from Sydney, from Australia, come to that show. So it felt like the early days of the Funhouse again. Felt like a really great time, really great show. And it's really great. I said great a lot there, but it's really cool that it could end with such a fond memories for them. After the breakup, they were all still a part of the scene that they helped start. Dennis, Ron, and Pip started a new band called The Visitors with Mark Sisto, who was a background singer for Radio Birdman. Ron also played with Warwick and Chris in a band called The Hitmen. Dennis, Rob, and Warwick would team back up to play in a touring band called New Race with members of MC5 and the Stooges. Rob also started a band called New Christ. The band has reunited quite a bit, the first time in 1996 for the Big Day Out tour. They even released a new album in 2006. It was the original lineup for those early reunions, but since 2002, it's been different. Dennis, Rob, and Pip are the only three from that classic lineup still associated with the band. That's the story of Radio Birdman, a band that really helped kickstart a revolution in the Australian music scene, a band that changed that country's music industry, I would argue for the better for the rest of time. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you're familiar with the band, if you have fond memories of the band, if you got to see them play, if you've gone to any of these reunion shows. Let me know what you think about the video, anything I missed that you think should have been covered. Drop all that in a comment below. Like the video if you ended up enjoying it. Subscribe if you want to join me as I'm learning more about music history. Once again, I want to give a huge thank you to the members of this channel. It really means a lot that you want to partner with me. I say that at the end of every video, but it's always true. It's just so cool that you want to like be a part of this. So can't thank you enough for that.